Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're back looking at the suggestions passed to the developers in September 2019, and after having a look at the aviation stuff, it's now time to have a look at the ground forces part. So once again, thank you to Coke Spray for putting together this list, and also thank you to everyone who has actually put in, suggestions to be passed. It's always wonderful reading through them. The first one is from Red Lines Burn, and it's talking about the M113 TOW and also the M901A1. Now, we kind of already have these in game, apart from they're slightly different. So first of all, we'll talk about the M113 TOW. If you have a look in War Thunder, there are two versions of this. We have the M113A1 TOW, which is right here for the Italians, and then for the Chinese, we have the M113A1 TOW as well. So they are incredibly similar to the M113 TOW, but they're not exactly the same. The A1 is the improved version, whereas this is just the standard version with the 50 cal and of course the TOW ATGM. If we're being honest, when it comes to the difference between them, there isn't really much at all, apart from the Otto Melara one having slight differences, at least realistically. I also believe the normal M113 was designed to just use the TOW and not the iTOW as well, but I'm sure it would be able to at some point. On top of this as well, you have the ITV M901. This is the M901 that we have in game as well. So we're seeing a bit of a pattern here, aren't we? From this past to developers, very similar to what we have in game. But this is the M901 that we have in game, the good old Wally, and the M901A1, which is what's being talked about here. The difference between the M901A1 and the M901 is that the M901 could fire TOWs, whereas the M901A1 could fire TOW 2s. So this one, as you can see, it can fire the iTOW, whereas the A1 could fire TOW 2s. So the difference between the M901A1 and the M901 is the type of ATGM it could fire, and the M113 TOW, you could also argue, is exactly the same. So, you have the TOW and then you have the iTOW, whereas with the 901 you have the iTOW and the TOW 2. The next vehicle to have a look at from Tigrillo is the SD KFC 250-11. Now this is one of the German half-tracks which was actually it was armed with the 28mm high-velocity cannon. Now we do actually have this cannon in game. If you want to have a look at its characteristics, it's found on the SD KFC 221, the little my little bush Wookie, I suppose, here, and it's the 20mm. It is a squeezy boy. Basically what you do is you take a 20mm gun and you force through it a 28mm round, and it creates this effect where it basically, I suppose you'd say, it angles the front of it, making it so it can go faster velocity, and also it has a higher penetration. So this was used by the Germans in this type of contraption, and it was also used by the British in the Long John adapter, which you could have for any 2-pounder gun. Unfortunately, we don't have that in game, but maybe at some point. But anyway, take that gun, the 2820 as it's known, add it to the SDKFC 250, which is of course the armored personnel carrier, and you get yourself a nice little interesting armored car. Generally, well, not armored car, but a decent little tank destroyer. When it comes to these half-tracks, something that we've seen in game is a push towards armored cars, and also IFVs. So you can have a look at the Warrior, the Bradley, the Puma, the SDKFC 234 series, which is in game. We also know that the 221 is coming into game, or the 211, I can't remember what it's called. Basically the one which is going to be an AA for China, that's also coming in. So why not have a look at the 250s with these armored, these armored half-tracks? Because you don't just have this version, you also have a version which was armed with a long-barreled 75. I'm sure you could find one M113, which was armed with a mortar. I know also there were similar armored half-tracks which had rockets mounted to them, and also the short-barreled 75, the stub gun. So overall, this would be a nice step into that arena to have these more mobile, interesting tank destroyers, which are hybrid compared to others. We have the armored cars now, as I said, in the form of the Puma. We have the tanks in the form of the Panzer IIIs and the 4s. Why not now have a conglomeration and a hybrid in the form of the 250? To me, that sounds really, really fun. The next one is the Object 1200. Now this is by Cade, and the Object 1200, it was a Russian wheeled armored car, and the idea was it was supposed to fill the role of an IFV or an armored personnel carrier. Pretty much the same role that the BMP has right now when it comes to in-game and also real life, and so therefore this machine was designed that you can see here to have a 3-man crew and also to be able to carry 8 people in the booty of it. Now, the design of this was made in 1965 because of a contest which was asking for some form of AFV for the Russian army. Now, the BMP that we all know and love in the game actually won that contest, and the Object 1200 lost to it, but the Object 1200 did bring together a lot of design ideas which were eventually used. So this is the BMP-1 with the, of course, the upgraded BMP-1P edition, which gives you, of course, the 9M113 instead of just the standard one. So when we talk about the Object 1200, it's obviously got a base of 8 wheels, which is interesting. It is also amphibious. It had 60 millimeters of armor on the front, which is quite decent, It's got a 300 horsepower engine with a power to weight of 21 per ton, which is, pretty good, especially in the mid-60s for one of these, one of these vehicles which is supposed to be amphibious and also to be able to be a troop carrier. And what is a little bit dodgy though is, so in testing they were basically testing the chassis and also the engine power and the amphibious nature and all of its movement characteristics. So what Cade has done here, he's photoshopped this image that you see, and what he's added to it is the gun and the ATGM. So this is how the machine would have looked if it was fully produced and ready, but in the testing it didn't have any weaponry attached to it. The weaponry itself was never attached to the vehicle, and obviously it has exactly the same turret as the BMP. So if we can imagine the BMP, then we can just imagine this with the BMP's turret on it. I personally am not okay with it, just because you never know how extra weight is going to react, even if you decide to account for it. At the same time, I understand if people would still be okay with putting this into the game. It obviously had the Malyutka missile, the 9K11, which would be keyboard guided in the game, exactly the same as the BMP-1, and also the 73mm on top of it. So it would be fun, as a vehicle. I think generally the BMPs are pretty good, but we've been pushing more and more into this armored car area of the game, so why not add some more of these vehicles to it, as long as you can get past the issues with the gun not being mounted properly, or not being mounted at all when it comes to it. The next vehicle is the Centurion Mk.13. Now this is the final designation of the Centurion ever to come about, and this is from Time for T. Now, this Centurion Mk.13 is a direct upgrade from a Centurion Mk.10, and what Time for T actually argues here is to try and create, instead of this being a standalone vehicle, why not make it a modification for the Mk.10 to make this into the Mk.13? And the example he gives is the BMP-1 to the BMP-1P. You could also give the example of the Conqueror to the Super Conqueror, where it gets add-on armor all over the machine if you want to, try and keep it British. So with the Conch that you see here, if you actually just do without the additional ballistic package, it used to be called, I think, the Super Conqueror package or something, you can see that it doesn't have the spaced armor on the turret and it doesn't have the blocks on the front. But once you add that in, then you can see it gets a lot more beefy when it comes to taking hits. So this technically makes the Conqueror to the Super Conqueror, if you want to see it like that. But that it wasn't its official designation, it's just, you know, kind of a nickname. So with this, it would be an official designation. So it would be changing the Cent Mk.13 to the Cent Mk.13. So what's the difference between the Cent Mk.10 and the Cent Mk.13? Well, the 13 has a few alterations. First of all, it has the ranging 50 cal. Now, this is something that you can see on pretty much a few of the vehicles, like the Chieftain Mark 3, the Chieftain Mark 5, and also the Vickers gun. It has this additional 50 cal, not that one. Is it this one? It's probably this one. It has this additional 50 cal, which is used for ranging the gun. So it's not really used as a coaxial. It's not really used to. It's not really designed to be against infantry. It's designed to fire in about 3-round bursts, and it's at the same muzzle velocity as the rounds that you're firing. Therefore, you use it to range a target, and that's how it works on the Chieftain and the Vickers. The Mark 13 also had this. That's why it has this extra hole that you can see here. So it has the normal coaxial 7.62, and then it has the 50 cal machine gun. On top of this as well, it had an extra turret basket on the back, which you can see in this picture here, this area right here. And something else that you can see in this picture, this big Mamba Jamba right here. So what it had access to was a massive IR headlamp, if I can just find its size. Here we go. Oh, sorry, yeah. It had a 22-inch infrared 1kW searchlight on the left side of the mantlet, and obviously being infrared, that's what it was used for. So, yeah, you could actually have an extra lamp, and you can see it here in this picture once again, to be used in night battles. Now, the Mark 10, which we already have in game, which this would be a direct, a direct improvement of. It already has, the night vision devices, so this would just be a nice little addition on top of that idea. So that's the way that you've got to see it. So you can see it's not that different compared to its other contemporary, the Mark 10. It also does have an extra thing as well. It has a thermal sleeve on the barrel. Now, a thermal sleeve is designed to keep the barrel cool while firing, so there isn't as much dispersion when it comes to the round. Because if you don't know, if you have, like, let's just say in general terms, I'll try and make it a layman term thing. So let's say if you heat metal, the metal itself will expand, and then when it cools again, it will retract. But if you have different metals, or if you have different compositions, or if you have even the same material, but it's a little bit wonky, when it retracts, it normally doesn't retract into the same place. It normally expands a little bit further than what it was before. So therefore, this can screw. If you have a completely straight barrel, and this keeps happening over time, then by expanding and retracting the metal from firing a bunch and then not firing for a while, and the metal itself cooling, depending on what obviously the weather is as well, then the barrel will stop lining up with the sight of the gun, and therefore there will be more dispersion and with the accuracy of your shells coming out of the gun. Now, modern systems such as the Abrams, they actually counter this by, through actually, I think something to do with their aiming system, like the FCS. They're actually able to counter this effect. But another way of doing it, which is probably a little bit cheaper, is through a thermal sleeve, which gives it a little bit of effectiveness. Now, the problem is, in game, the idea of this is not implemented. Barrel distortion isn't a mechanic in War Thunder, and I think it would be a bad idea to actually add it in, because it's only going to decrease the player experience. Because let's say you make sleeves a modification, Well, first of all, now we are putting an even larger barrier than we already have between a stock vehicle and a spaded vehicle, and they're supposed to be at the same BR. So therefore, you know, we already have all of these crazy things with ammunition types and now NVDs and thermals, also artillery, and even simple things like parts and FPE, which make a vehicle stock completely different to a spaded. So I don't want to add to that. On top of it as well, the idea that you're going to get punished for trying to fire at a target over a period of time is just really not really cricket in a way. Having negative effects happen to your vehicle which you cannot control generally is not looked well upon, at least in my opinion. So yeah. It did have a thermal sleeve though, so at least it would be physically different, but when it comes to in-game, it shouldn't really make a difference. So you can see that there aren't that many differences between the Mk.13 and the Mk.10, but I do think it would be nice to see. The next set of vehicles is from Ascent, and this is the AWX 1978 and the AWX 1983. Now, the best way for me to describe these is that they are prototypes of what would eventually become the Type 87. Now we have the Type 87 in game. It's an 8.0 radar guided AA for the Japanese, very similar to the Gepard and very similar to every other ATO machine that we have. You know, it has the two 35mm Oerlikons, has access to radar, you know, has access to all of the nice little bells and whistles that all the other stuff has. Isn't very well, you know, isn't very well armored, but is based on some form of modified chassis, which is the Type 74 chassis. Now, the AWX 1978, which is the first push towards this new set of AA, because you've got to remember this time the Jag stuff. It's very right. The JGSDF, you know, the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force. They started a project in the 70s to replace the M15A1 and the M42. So they were still using the Duster in the 70s, which shows how far behind they were on at least AA, technology from the ground. The M42 was still used until 1994, which is kind of crazy. So in the 70s, they were trying to replace them. In 1978, they got a Type 61 hull, which we do have in game, which is, let's see, this machine right here. So they took its chassis that you can see, popped off its turret and added this newfangled machine to the top, the turret that they've created. Now this is the same turret that you see on the Type 87, but it's just, obviously you can see that all of the radar stuff has been, it's in, let's call it a mobile position, meaning that this is the position you would have it in if you were traveling. So the problem that they found using the Type 61 chassis is that the turret was too big for it. So therefore that idea pretty much went out of the window. The chassis itself was too small, and also it didn't have smoke launchers or the missile laser detector. Now I'm not exactly sure what that is talking about. Asens is, I believe, Japanese. I might be wrong. But some of this is definitely worded a little bit weirdly, so I'm not sure what that would talk about. Also, the Type 61 had a diesel-powered generator for the radar, of course, and also there were probably some small changes through the structure, probably tried to take off some armor, just like they did the Type 74. The next vehicle is the AWX 1983, which is very, very similar to what we have in the form of the Type 87. And what this is the only real differences between this, the AWX 83 and the Type 87, is first of all, you can attach a mine roller to the front of it. So obviously huge difference there, and that's basically thanks to these two areas. And then you also didn't have smoke launchers. I don't think we need a vehicle in the game which is that similar to the Type 87. Like the thing is, right, so these two ideas are really cool. The problem is their functionality is exactly the same as a Type 87. The differences that they have do not change them enough from what the Type 87 does. So the Type 87, it has 235s, it has radar, and it shoots down aircraft. The turrets on all three of these vehicles is exactly the same. So the chassis is the only difference, and on the 1983 they use a Type 74 chassis. So even that is the same as the Type 87 one. So if you are going to add in these other two AAs, then you're just going to have 3 80 AAs, which all do exactly the same thing. So it just seems a little bit odd for something to be picked like that. The next vehicle is from DCT PB Pen. I think is how you say that, and they're talking about, or he is talking about, the M10 with the 105mm Type 91 howitzer on it. Now, the way that this is described is very interesting when it comes to the actual description of it, and so I'm going to read it for you. Attempting to force peace, the US enacted an arms embargo in 1946. It failed spectacularly and was quickly lifted the following year. Almost immediately demilitarized M10s and other vehicles were transferred into service with the ROC Nationalist Forces. However, with the original armament having been sabotaged, they had been bought under the guise of being tractors, the Chinese had to improvise. So the problem with this sentence here is the arms embargo didn't fail spectacularly. I don't think there's a way that it could fail spectacularly. The problem is what was happening is people, as with all embargoes and as with all trade disputes, what happens is people try and sell things which are the same as before, but under different names. So let's say that you have a transfer of a object, and it's just called Object A, right? And you want to transfer it to another country. That country bans Object A. So what I do as the person who's selling Object A, I now rename it Object B, and I slightly change either its chemical composition or its description, and then I transport it to the country again. Then they ban A and B, now it's time to bring out C, and just keep going on. That is basically what is happening in this situation. They wanted to sell their M10s to the Chinese, and because of this arms embargo, they sent them all of the parts for the M10s, apart from the thing which made it go, boom. Then basically said to them, okay, you can improvise by doing this, right? By, adding this specific gun. And that's exactly what the ROC Nationalist Forces did. So saying that it was a spectacular failure, I think, is a little bit over-aggrandizing. And also, I wouldn't call these demilitarized. They just needed to be put together. So the M10s that we used, obviously they're sent in the hole in the turret and everything. What the ROCs decided to do was to add the Type 91 105mm howitzer to it. And these were actually used in the Battle of Kinmen. And they didn't just add the 105mm howitzer. You can see from these pictures as well, they took away the little bits of... I don't want to say curtain because that's not the right word, but I can't. Whatever canvas. They took away the bit of canvas that you put on top of the M10, and they added some extra plating to it, so you could actually cover from the top. I'm guessing the idea of doing this was to try and provide some cover from the air, or provide some cover from artillery, or just people trying to pop up to the tank and maybe throwing grenades in. But they added a bit of metal to the top. They also added a machine gun and of course the 105mm howitzer. Now the 105mm could fire AP, it could fire HE, it could fire a conglomeration of different ammunitions, and for me it would be lovely just to see it. It would also bring something unique to the Chinese tech tree. We can obviously see here that it was fitted, it was designed, even though, they also added a coaxial 30 cal here, but if you look at the picture here, there is also another gun which is on the top. That's either a 50 or a 30. My guess, just looking from this picture, is probably a 30, but I don't, want to take too much of a guess. But yeah, why not throw this in? It'll be a little bit of fun to it. The last vehicle is by Cade once again, and it's talking about the Char D2, or another failed French tank. Now I'm going to tell you the story of the D2, and I want to see if you can see any resemblance between it and nearly every other French tank of the era. So, the Char D1 existed. The D1 was a very simple tank. It was a vehicle which used a lot of parts from stuff like the old Renault FT back in the day, and what the French wanted to do was they wanted to take the D2 and take the D1 and further develop it into the D2 to bring it around to the modern era. Now we're talking about mid-1930s here while they're making these decisions, so they want to upgun it, up-armor it, give it a better engine, do all those wonderful things. Now, they made this prototype, you know. The prototype was made with the short-barreled 47, the one that you find in infamous favour on some of these French vehicles. So stuff like the FCM-36, you know, the good old pyramid head with the chode launcher. So this is the short-barreled 37 that you see, and they also use the short-barreled 47, I believe, if I can find it anywhere. Is there actually? Oh, it might be. Yes, it's this one. So on the AMC, so they used this gun here, which fires 27mm worth of wonderful penetration. So they added this 47 to the Char D2. They up-armored it, but what they didn't do is they didn't add the 75mm from the Char B1. And what happened with the Char D2 is eventually, when it was being designed, they thought, okay, well, if we can't build enough Char B2s, you know, the big Humber Jumbers, the B1 Bisses, and also the Char B2s, if they couldn't make enough of these monstrosities, then the French army would be supplemented with Char D2s. That was the general idea that they were going with. So, you know, the prototype goes past, and guess what? They actually decide to the original plan, or the original order, was for 750 of these vehicles, and they'd worked out a few teething issues at this point. They'd replaced the short 47mm with the long 47mm. I just want to make sure that I'm not wrong on this. Yes, they changed the short 47mm into the long 47mm, giving it a bit more penetration and usefulness against other vehicles. You know, they dealt with some of the issues when it came to the tracks, because the tracks had an issue of falling off all the time, and so 750 of these monstrosities were ordered, and in true French style they made 50 of them by the time that the war started, and and the production batch was actually, it was so the initial order, the initial production was supposed to be 750, and then it got reduced to 100 in two batches, and the two batches were the one which had the APX-1 turret, which was selected, which had the short 47mm, so this one that you see here and here, and then the second 50, which were also upgunned. The second set were upgunned with the APX-1A turrets that you can see here, had the long-barreled 47, which you could find on the AMC 35 right here, the SA 35. So this had a little bit more firepower when it came to it, you know, 62mm a pen, which is lovely. So we've already had manufacturing problems, we've already had strike problems. This sounds like every other French vehicle of the time. And then, when it actually came out and it was ready to go, they realized it was completely useless because it kept breaking down and it had too many issues when it came to its not ammunition, but its actual gun. The gun was just not satisfactory against what it was fighting, and because of the track issues that they had and also the engine issues, this thing was completely useless. So by the time of the start of the war, this machine was used in the reserves. It wasn't even allowed to be in frontline service. That was designed more for the Char B1s and the B2s, and so the idea that this was ever going to replace the B1 or ever going to be, used alongside it was just never realized, because it was just so bad as a vehicle. And on one of the battles that it actually went into, and also these were commanded by Charles de Gaulle, so another wonderful thing that Charles de Gaulle did. So around about 50 vehicles were actually put into battles. 21 of them were destroyed in combat, and 38 of them were just left in the field because they broke down. That is a horrific number of vehicles. You're talking about 59 vehicles out of 100 there, which were either knocked out or were, they broke down while being used in the field. Only 21 tanks were captured at the surrender in 1940, and they were used to build like pillboxes and armored trains, basically used as glorified tractors by the Germans. They even realized how useless these were. The Germans took a lot of the French chassis, which were actually pretty good, and converted them into either just using the vehicles themselves, the tanks, or like some form of artillery tractors, which would carry 105s or even larger guns. This thing, no, it was literally relegated to hoiking around materials for other things, which is just a massive indictment on how bad this machine was. So yeah, it was not a good machine. It had a bunch of issues when it came to its production, had a pretty interesting turret, but of course only one person manning it. Wonderful three-man crew as usual. I just wish that the French had got their production sorted in the 30s and also went away from these armored boxes without even thinking about, anything to, the engineering component of these tanks saddens me so much, because you see how they could be useful. You see how these machines could have really taken over the world, but no. They couldn't, because they just couldn't work out how suspension worked, and they couldn't work out how power to weight worked. Anyway, there's a lot of really interesting suggestions here. I would very much look forward to the Object 1200 and also the M10 with the 105s on them. Everything else is a little bit lackluster, but still would be lovely to see in the game. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Mopar 1969, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyans Terry, and Eel of Goats, and of course Seductive Trash Can for supporting the channel.